Good morning, folks. Thanks for joining me. We are recording, so this session can be revisited, and it is actually a nice general companion piece to some of the information that Dr. Vanderheyden shared this morning. So you're here for data literacy, strategic use of the data. And we will. This is me. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about myself, but if you need anything, there is my information. And I realize my email's wrong, so I'll have to go in and fix that on every slide. You've heard the web norms already, so I'll just remind them. I am going to try to get you to engage. And so if you have an opportunity, if you have multiple screens, I'm hoping that you'll participate, but I understand if you can't. I appreciate your perspective and especially your questions, because I know we're all here for kids. And just a reminder that Act 48 is due July 31st, especially if you wanted Act 48 hours or the book deal, as we say. The outcomes for our hour together, first, is to make and plan to use data strategically and systematically to find potential groups of students with similar needs. You know, this is something that we do every year, but takes on an increased level of intensity this year because so much time has passed. We really don't know where students kind of end with their ability and their entering achievement level. And then to examine and plan for what we do with them next. Once we figure out where they are, what are the instructional options? And I'm trying to give you a real concrete path to do that with some examples and a protocol. So hopefully that will be helpful to you. Before we jump into that though, I'm curious. I want you to think about where you are right now, your internal weather. And what is that weather report right now? If you are, as you are trying to think about what do I need to do in order to determine students entering achievement levels? I've given you all editing rights, actually. If you would, these are all movable stickers, so you can copy. If you would please copy, don't cut. And then you can paste your internal weather report in our slide. It's all anonymous, but I'm just curious, you know, when you're thinking about how do I figure out their entering achievement level, what's the weather report? I like partly cloudy, partly sunny. That gives us some hope. That gives us a sense of efficacy. I'm hoping it'll end up as a rainbow right after the rain, and we'll all come out on the other side. Oh, I've got some sunny. That's fantastic. Very positive. Okay. Oh, didn't mean to do that. Give you all a couple minutes just to find the PowerPoint. And if you can paste your weather report into the slide, that would be fantastic. I'm glad I don't see any storm clouds or lightning or typhoon or hurricane, right? I mean, some of this is not new for us, right? This is an opportunity for us just to continue to hone our skills. So thank you for sharing. I appreciate that. I appreciate the positive outlook. So as we're thinking about how we determine a student's entering achievement level, right, we have to think about how do we find children who might need more than what we're already doing? Like what is, and actually we might need to find children who need more of the core from last year. And, you know, we don't want to do it in a way that feels random or even potentially like we're shooting arrows at Jello, right? We want to do it systematically. And so we need to think about it in a very concrete, linear process. We're going to look at which students. We're going to look at all of them, right? And so we're going to put them all into this big funnel, this big assessment system or analysis process where we're going to try to figure out where are they in relation to where we want them to be. And some of the students are going to get stuck because their needs are so much bigger than the rest of the group, right? And we might have some who have needs, but they might be less significant, you know, than our 911ers, as I kind of refer to them. But best case scenario, right, is that they all kind of fall through because we have a large population of kiddos who just need grade level expectations for the fall. With the COVID closure, this picture may look very different. We may have fewer students who are ready for grade level expectations and more who have significant needs or even bigger needs. And therefore, our core instruction may start to look a little different. And in order to try to discern where they are, no one data type is going to get us there, right? So we have the data pieces that dig in and give us a lot of information. And you heard Dr. Amanda Vanderheyden talk about that, you know, the reliability of screening kids right now or collecting data, if we're doing it remotely, may not be the most valid and reliable way. So when we're thinking about the types of assessments, we're really thinking about what do we already have? You know, do we have CDTs or Edmentum, MobiMax, iReady, any of these other pieces that have been administered to students in the past? Because historical data is going to be very beneficial for us. Next, we have summative. Now, we don't have summative data from this past spring, but we have summative for our older students. We have summative data from 2 years ago. We may also have summative data from some of the last units that we did before we left before the COVID closure. And the same goes for benchmark and formative assessments, right? Benchmark, when we left on March 13th, right around there, some of you were able to get your third benchmark in and some weren't. So you may have been using benchmark data from January. We probably, at this particular time, have the most formative, and that really tells us where were students functioning last spring. But it's going to take us looking at all of these to try and figure out groups of students who have similar needs. Well, short of taking each individual student and doing a deep dive, that's a very time-intensive process. How can we use these strategically to our advantage? So which type of assessment do you think is robust enough that we can measure every student against the same target? So thinking about our last most recent universal piece of data. I'm not going to have you mention it in the chat, but personally, just think about which one of these assessments, one or both or more than one, is robust enough that if we ask ourselves how close to where we want students to be, which one is going to have enough information or be strong enough and valid enough to give us some reliable results? It is going to be our summative and benchmark, right? Because if we're thinking about diagnostic, we're not really necessarily measuring students against the same targets. We're measuring them against wherever they happen to be when they took that diagnostic test. And the formative, while it will tell us hopefully where they are in relation to whatever objective we were teaching, it's not really robust because it's often very narrow in scope. So our summative and benchmark data that we happen to have from last year is going to be our best first place to start. And if you have any questions about the different types of assessment, there is a link there, the data handout, that will kind of overview if you need more information about the assessment types. So we're going to start with our benchmark and summative data. How do we know where they are? What do we do first? Well, first of all, that data is going to give us a normal distribution. It's going to tell us where students fall. They're either going to be right where they need to be, slightly above or slightly below, or really high or really below. Think of this. This is that same funnel that I just showed you, but now it's turned on its side. So we're hoping that, we'll have a whole large population of students who, through our assessment system, are coming out green, saying they're ready for whatever's next. But the reality is we might have more yellow, we might have more red than we had planned, and fewer dark blue and light blue than in years past. But each one of these groups of students, right, we're not talking about individual students at this point, we're talking about a distribution and where are they in relation to where we want them to be. This is a group of students who likely are going to have some of the same needs. So this is our first step in trying to figure out some sense of their entering achievement level. We can do this right now. I mean, it's July 27th, right? And you have all of the data you need to do this process as teachers and administrators. If you don't have spring benchmark data, as I mentioned, you have January. If you have students who took the PSSA 3rd grade on up, you have PVOS projections that go 2 years out that tell us where they think students will be in 2 years, and it works just like a benchmark. Now, obviously, they are not as reliable because hopefully there's a lot of intervention that has happened in between the first year's projection and the second year's projection. So hopefully those projections will only improve or increase, but they can be very valuable in this process. And finally, any of the PSSA data that you might have from the 2018-19 school year. Do you have any other summative or benchmark data available to help us determine where our students are? Does anybody have anything that could add to that list? If so, you can just throw it in the chat. Which reminds me, I am by myself here, but I am happy to answer questions in the chat. So don't feel like you have to wait. I can always try and answer them on the fly as we're moving through. The only other piece that I might suggest here in terms of summative or benchmark data is, do you have common assessments? Were you able to administer common assessments either before the closure or as a result at the end of the year? Did you do anything to kind of determine where students were right then? And were they in relation to end of year expectations? If you were able to do something last spring, that might be something else that you have available to you. Okay. So I want to introduce to you this protocol, and this is now that we've kind of identified where our groups of students are based on our on level, slightly above, slightly below, very high, and very low. Since we have them, we're going to kind of put them into large groups. And this particular protocol, if you click on this screen, you'll see that a copy of a classroom-based protocol pops up. Okay, and this is it should be in read-only, so if you want to make changes to it, you'll have to save it to your drive. But what I've tried to do is kind of step by step say, okay, you've done this, right? You've looked at the data you have in your system, now what? What are we saying to teachers? What are the next steps? What should we be thinking about? So I'm going to take you through this protocol as we go through the rest of the presentation. So here is where you would record the names of the students. And you'll notice in the distribution, I really said, 5 groups of students, but here I've narrowed it down to 3. So here's, who are those students that for which this entering instructional level is potentially too high, just right, or too low, right? So these are our students who are on level. These are our students who are potentially above level, and these are our students who are below level. But within each of these columns over here, we've got some gradations, right? We have, for instructional levels potentially too low, we have some for which it's a little low and some for which it is really too low because they are so far ahead. So this is really where we kind of start. So let's look at our students who are just right, potentially just right. And so that group of students, if you think about the normal distribution, is going to fall right about here. So 1 to 2 standard deviations above and 1 standard deviation below where you would expect them to be. This being the 50th percentile, right? So this is hopefully this is your largest group of students. You know, ideally in an MTSS framework, we want this to be like 80 to 85% of our students, but we're going to take whatever we get, you know, whatever they come to us with. And for students for whom they're ready to start the year because the level is just right, we know that we're going to be checking in on their grade level skills, right? We're going to be determining maybe a little more granularly where they're at, because a benchmark or summative is not going to tell us where their, you know, a fourth grader's fifth grade level skills are. They're not going to, that benchmark assessment is not going to tell us what their unit level skills or unit level content mastery level is. But we know that students who come to us just right are going to be learning those things. And even though they need grade level content, they still are going to require potentially some differentiation. And that differentiation might be core instruction with a little bit more in terms of advanced, or it might be a targeted skill development. Maybe they're coming with most of the grade level skills and they just need some cleaning up or some catching up. So hopefully this is our biggest group. So now it's time, okay, what do we do with that information? Now that we know where students are likely to land, what's that have to do with unit 1 or unit 2 of my math series or my literacy unit? Well, we've got to make connections for the teachers, right? And help them see that students who are coming to us just right, that's not the end of the process. We still need to check in to see where are they in relation to the specific unit objectives or prerequisite skills that they're going to need to be successful. So I've given you some examples in the folder, the handout folder. I've given you a math example, and I've given you an elementary math example and a middle school history example. But any teacher, as they're getting ready to launch into a new unit, and by unit, right, we all kind of define unit differently, but a unit is a collective group of objectives. It has a clear starting and ending point, and that ending point is really that point at which we summatively assess. Have they demonstrated proficiency for this unit? Not for the whole year, but just for this unit. And so I want teachers thinking about this a unit at a time, not a whole big year. So in the first box would be where we put our unit objectives or the unit skills and any prerequisite skills that might be necessary in order to be successful in the unit objectives. I think one of the examples that I gave you in the folder is math instruction. So pull that one up here. Copy of, yep. So just to give you an idea, to contextualize this a little bit, I want to make sure I'm still sharing. Okay. If we're thinking about grade 4, right, and we're looking at a unit on adding, subtracting fractions that have like denominators, we've got a group of unit objectives and unit skills, and then we've got prerequisites. Well, you know, students still need to be able to recognize and generate equivalent fractions in order to be able to add and subtract them. So they need to be able to say, are these equivalent fractions? And if they aren't, do I understand how to make them equivalent fractions so that I can add and subtract them, right? Those are some of the things that we need to ask ourselves. Do they have the pieces necessary in order to move forward? So this is what the teacher would do, is kind of record those skills in this protocol. which helps them think about what the students who are potentially on level might need in terms of additional skill development or differentiation or enrichment. Now, in order to determine what they might need, right, we're sitting in a unit, this adding and subtracting fractions with like denominators, and we're trying to figure out who needs some gaps filled in and who doesn't need that, because they're like ready to run. You know those kiddos, right? A lot of times those kiddos might be a smaller in number, but they might be sitting there going, when are we going to get to the stuff that's new for me? So we have to figure out what are the two pieces in here that we need to take a look at. Well, for starters, we're going to use some sort of formative assessment. And that formative assessment might be something like mind mapping. Like I might start with saying to students, where do you think you are in terms of adding and subtracting fractions with like denominators? I might ask them to predict. I might ask them to rate themselves. And any student who's sitting there going, oh, I don't know if I can do this. Well, you know, that's telling me already they have this, they're in the just right group. So they have the what they basically need, but they're ready for the unit. Like they're ready for me as a teacher to teach. But then we might have some students who are saying, ooh, you know, I think I can already do it. And for those students, we need to think about deeper, more complex instructional plans. So here's some assessment. Sometimes I'll hear from teachers who say, I don't have time to pre-assess. To that I say, we don't have time not to. Right? We don't always have to pre-assess all students the same way. If we have a class of 28 students and 25 of them are saying, I need this, I'm rating myself a 1 or a 2, well then we only need to do a little more intense pre-assessment for 3 of the students, right? Let's use the student voice to help us understand. Now you'll notice that one of the assessment ideas I have here is some sort of skill-based quiz, not for the skills that they're going to get, not that we're going to teach, but for those prerequisite skills that we've already identified. Maybe I want to see, can they recognize and generate equivalent fractions? So here's where I would record the assessments that I'm going to use, right? And I think in my example, I probably had, let's see, some of the examples that I had put in were maybe I'd get a 3rd grade unit assessment. Maybe I would use an assessment from 3rd grade, especially because right now we're talking about where are students, but what would be, you know, where are they as a result of the closure? Maybe I would want to use some of my CDT data. Maybe I don't even need to administer another assessment. Or maybe I just need a formative assessment from grade 3 that measures those prerequisite skills. For those students who are evidencing that they might already be working a little above, maybe I do want to give them a pre-test for the unit of new skills. So, you know, we want to plan for the assessments we're going to use, and that way it doesn't really look like we're only pre-assessing one group. We're going to plan the assessments out for all the groups at once before we administer instruction. Now, hopefully from these formative assessments, for those kids who aren't quite secure in skills, we'll be able to plan some mini lessons on some of the content or some of the unsecured skills. Maybe in a bell ringer, I'll revisit some prior knowledge, maybe do some skill refresher work. I'll know if that's necessary when I look at the data for these students. And for those students who are secure in some of the unit, maybe there are lessons that they don't have to participate in, or maybe they can use a strategy like most difficult first, where they do the hardest problems first, and as long as they have them, they can move on to something and use their time, maybe doing some enrichment types of activities. And then what are we going to do with them, right? Like, what is the instructional plan? Well, I try to delineate between instructional adjustments. So those are those differentiation pieces. Those are those tweaks to the core that are usually good for all students. And then we look at enrichment. Now this enrichment in this particular case does not imply that all students aren't getting enrichment. It's just that we might have a group here who are ready for it a little sooner or a little deeper. And then in the just right group, we would put the instructional plans in there for step 5. So what are we going to do? Now, the just right group is kind of the easiest, hopefully the biggest. Now let's move on to our group for whom the assigned instructional level is likely to be really high, right? So up here you can see this is our lower, these are our students who are evidencing performance that's much lower, maybe 1 to 2 standard deviations below. And so they might not only not have grade level skills secure, but they might actually have below level or even foundational skills that are not secure. And so for these students, we're really looking at the very least, some targeted skill development, which may be some of the same skill development that our just right students or on-level students may need. We may, as a result of seeing this group, not know how low is low, so the target may be unclear. And they're likely going to need some potential intervention. So let's take a look at this group of students. We're still working with the same unit objectives and prerequisite skills, right? We're not teaching this group of students a different unit. We're trying to make this set of objectives and skills more accessible to our students who are struggling. So this is our group of students, and just like we did over here in the just right category, the first question we're going to ask is, are there gaps in prerequisite skills, right? Because if these kiddos have gaps, there's a good chance these kiddos also have gaps. The question is, are those gaps smaller or are they bigger, right? So we have to develop some assessments, or we have to distribute some assessments that are going to help us drill down. So we need something much more robust than a formative assessment to either figure out, is it just filling in gaps, or are we filling in gaps that are from last spring and before, right? In which case we're going to really need something a little more robust, like a diagnostic. So what could we use in this 4th grade example? Well, obviously CDTs might be something that would benefit. We can still use our grade 3 assessments, but we also might want to know, because one of our prerequisite skills is their ability to, or their fluency with expressing whole numbers as fractions or generating fractions, we might want to do some fluency practice with them, or some fluency assessment to see where their number sense is. Once we have kind of drilled down, right, and to figure out how big is this gap, for students for whom the gap is smaller, we're going to do some of the same things. We're going to bring those students into our mini lessons on content. We're going to do bell ringers to revisit prior knowledge. So we're not creating more work. We're just strategically going to use this strategy, and it's going to address the needs of more students. We might have students, though, who need gaps filled in for the current unit and gaps for the prerequisite year. So this group of students may include all of these students, but this group of students may not include all of these. And these are the students for whom we really need to figure out how to catch them up. We need to use some standard protocol interventions and really work in there at whatever level they are on the continuum. And I think about what Dr. Vanderhayden had said this morning. The spring math will help us kind of tease out, or PALS, or any of these diagnostic assessments will help us tease out some of those fine and more sensitive skills that are likely to increase the chance for achievement, for our students. What we would do differently, right? And it doesn't matter, like I've put some literacy intervention topics in here as well as numeracy, for our students who are really, really discrepant and who have gaps that are beyond just, gaps for the unit. And a standard protocol intervention on phonology, phonics, numeracy, word problem schema, something that really targets the specific skill that they're discrepant in. Because instructional matching is also really important. Whereas our students who maybe just have some gaps, some bigger gaps for the unit, we can still use some of our evidence-based strategies in the course, small group, explicit instruction, thinking about barriers to their learning through UDL. What might we be able to do? Thinking about our literacy kiddos. If the skill is a comprehension skill, what can we do in terms of getting them access to the text that's not necessarily that they're reading it, because that might be where the barrier is, but they can still listen to the text and they can still participate in the comprehension. And so for this, oops, I forgot to move our little square over. It really should be over here, right? Because this is where we're going to record what our plan for support is for our group for whom the instructional level is going to be really high. This is our third group, right? Our third group is for that group for whom the instructional level might be too low. And that's because they might be evidencing, at any given unit, they might already have those skills, or they might actually even be beyond the whole grade level of skills. And these are our students who are really functioning up here. Now, I refer to them as advanced learners. Might there be some students identified as gifted in here? Yes. But you know what? There might be some students identified as gifted in here and in here. So I'm not really looking at this through the lens of students identified as either with a specific learning disability or identified as gifted. I'm really saying, where are they right now in relation to the content I, as a teacher, am getting ready to deliver? And so our students in this particular group, they may need things like acceleration. Maybe we don't know how high is high, so we're going to need to do some diagnostic for them, but they might benefit from enrichment through things like compaction or some core instruction with differentiation. Most difficult first was one of the examples that I had given earlier. So let's take a look again. At this point, if we are not accelerating them for the whole unit or more, they are still being held to the same expectations as in terms of unit objectives and prerequisite skills. The reality is we just might have some students who've already met those prerequisites and really don't need as much instruction in terms of acquiring new knowledge, but may need more time to do the enrichment where it's applying what they know in authentic and meaningful ways. So this is the group of students we're talking about now, for whom potentially the instructional level is too low. And what is it we want to know, right? We might have students who are, they know a lot of the lower level skills for a unit, but they can't apply that information, right? So these are our kiddos who are highly fluent, highly accurate in literacy or math, but they're not ramping up that level of rigor. Or we might have students who, they already not only have the new skills, but they have applied it in authentic and meaningful ways, and they really don't need the whole unit at all. So we need to investigate, where does this group fall? Where should we be looking? What are the assessments that we can do to determine their instructional level? Students over here on this side for whom maybe they just, we have students who might be really high this unit and not the next. And so really they just need some change in instruction for this unit. And so they might compact out of some of the formative assessments, some of the classwork, some of the homework, maybe even some of the summative assessments, and take it right to, I'm going to work on an enrichment level task. These students, likely these students over here are students who we're starting to have that conversation, like, are they really even getting anything out of the current grade level? You know, and should we be considering acceleration? I'm not really going to spend a lot of time on acceleration and making that decision in this presentation, because I think it impacts the smallest number of students. But there is a session on acceleration on day 3 that is going to kind of unpack a protocol or ways in which we can determine if acceleration is appropriate for our most advanced students. I have included this in here because this is an evidence-based protocol that helps look at potential needs for acceleration. You'll notice that there isn't any one data piece here. If we're going to make a decision as big as acceleration, we can't rely on any one data. I will be happy to entertain questions at the end if there's time, or direct you to the acceleration session on Wednesday. But what are we going to do in terms of planning for support? What would the instruction look like for these students? Well, we've already talked about the on-level students. Some of them may need enrichment, and really, some of these kiddos may need enrichment, right? So we're not talking about reinventing the wheel. We're talking about the fact that we might have this group of students for whom enrichment sooner or at a higher level might be most appropriate because they don't need some of our initial acquiring of new skills and knowledge instruction. And I think in an online environment, this can actually work even more conveniently than sometimes it does in a face-to-face environment. And then our other group of kiddos, you know, there's actually 20 different types of acceleration. They all ultimately result in moving faster through the curriculum and kind of ending up out of sequence. You know, and by that what I mean is usually kindergartner goes to first grade, does all the first grade goes to second grade goes to third grade. You get the pattern. But when you accelerate a student, you have a student who might go from first to third. Now they might skip second, or they might go through first and second so quickly that they do that in 1 year and they're ready for third grade as a second grader. And those are very general explanations. But acceleration is not something that as a teacher that they would necessarily be able to make those decisions in a vacuum. That's something that's going to take a lot more planning, prep, consideration for what we're talking about. So I would imagine that acceleration for a teacher kind of takes it a little bit off the table because we would want to put that student somewhere where they're receiving new information. So how do we take all of this? I didn't get a chance to ask you all, you know, what role you provide or what role you come to the table with. But I was thinking about, like, if this protocol were rolled out, what should principals do? And so I was thinking about, you know, from a principal perspective, you would want to pull your benchmark or your summative data and start to look at it and start to get those groups of students. So you know generally, like, who's going to need what assessments and who's potentially going to need what supports, because that's your groups, right? We have lived in a world for a very long time where we take great pride in the fact that we want to meet every student's needs individually. Here's the reality. We don't have the time, the energy, the resources to take each individual student and say, where are you? We've got to do this effectively and efficiently, somewhere between everybody gets their own quote unquote individualized education plan and everybody gets the same thing, right? The extreme ends, or if we look at it this way, you know, the extreme ends are incredibly time consuming. And what happens is we miss the middle. So what we got to do is kind of look at this from groups of students rather than individuals. Share the expectations for classroom-based assessments with teachers. Giving teachers an opportunity to say, what do I have access to? What do I need? You know, do I have, if I'm assessing a fourth grader's ability to identify and generate equivalent fractions, do I have assessments that are geared toward that? Do I have access to third grade assessments that I could use to check that skill? And then to provide resources that adjust instruction. And that resource might be helping teachers better understand what does differentiation that's enrichment, or I mentioned a couple strategies in here like the study guide plan and compaction and enrichment and tiered assignments. How do our teachers understand what those are? So maybe some of them need some professional development in those areas. Maybe some of them need to know what standard protocol interventions are even available and how do I instructionally match? So I think from a principal's perspective, there's a lot here, right? And you know, hopefully some of this is not new and some of this has already been started, but then how do you communicate this so that the action plan for the teachers would be, okay, I see this protocol. I'm ready to give this a shot. And I gave you an example of a fourth grade, but really when we're thinking about this process is how it works for non-tested areas too. I gave you an example of a history, an 8th grade history unit. You know, we've got prerequisite skills that we're assuming students are coming with for our unit. And as teachers, we have to ask ourselves, how much support is that student going to need in order to be successful in my unit? What aren't they coming with that I need to fill in the gaps? So I've included an example in here for 8th grade middle school. So as we're kind of coming to a close, my reflection questions for you, you know, I would ask, first of all, is this systematic use of data, right? The 4 data types and what we do with it and how we organize it, is it present in your system? And how could you communicate this to all educators effectively? Like how could we, because sometimes we get data overload, right? It becomes very overwhelming. So how might we communicate this to educators? What supports do you need as a principal and what supports do you need as a teacher? So I'm going to give you an opportunity before we go to the Act 48 and the reflection questions. May I answer any questions? I don't see any in the chat, but feel free to unmute yourself or to throw some questions in the chat. Does this systematize or make it concrete kind of the process, or is there still some fuzziness or some confusion? I used to say questions, comments, I'll even take complaints. Well, you all have my email, so if you have any questions when you go back, I know that I had talked to one of you that, you know, this is a lot of information in one day. So I think today is all about it's coming in. And then if you're like me, I need to take a walk and I need to go out there and process it. I need to think about like, where does this fit? So I think that will be, this might come back to you in like 2 weeks. And you might say, you know what, I'm ready to go back and revisit it. And know that we're here. We've got tax staff who are poised to support you in this. And I'm just looking at the chat now. Let's see. Well, I hope the templates are helpful. And if you make any of them better, I would ask that you please share them back with me, because I really, I love examples that I can show people. And so this was, This is manageable, but it, like everything else, it takes planning. So it takes time. And, you know, one of the things that I'm excited about as we kind of move into this newer version of what school looks like sometimes is I'm hoping that we do more collaboration among teachers. Because if I were an individual teacher looking at this process, I'd be like, where am I going to find time to do all of this by myself? That's not an efficient, effective way to handle it, right? We really want, this is something that we should be looking at as a grade level, and we should be able to share and collaborate. This is too much for any one person. So I look forward to supporting you, and if you have any ideas, I'm happy to take them. I'll just kind of wrap things up here. If in your evaluation, did this meet your expectations based on the description? And how do you think you might share or use this information? I'm letting you go early. I will hang out here in case anybody has any questions. But our keynoter will be, let's see. Our keynote is at 12:15, so now y'all have bought yourself a little bit of lunchtime. Hopefully you get up and walk around and grab something to drink. Or get something to eat if you're going to join us. If not, you're going to take the next session off. I understand, and we'll see you a little bit later today. Thanks so much, folks. I really appreciate you hanging out with me today.